Hey everybody, I'm Jason with Isn't Life Curious and Curious About Cannabis. In case you don't know who I am already, I am a biologist, an educator, and a laboratory operations specialist that's been working in the natural product space for about the past 15 years or so. I started off early on studying mycology, later studying botany. I was a botanist for a short time for the federal government before I ended up starting work with a company that was trying to set up a cannabis research and testing laboratory. And that really set the trajectory for my career after that. I spent a lot of time helping to build, we actually built one of the first accredited and licensed laboratories in Oregon. Later went on to manage all sorts of laboratory locations across Oregon and across North America. And eventually I got a little burnout of the commercial cannabis testing space and ended up kind of jumping ship for a little while. I went and worked on a cannabis farm for one of my friends for a season, and then eventually decided what I really wanted to spend my time doing was research and development on the product manufacturing side. So I started to help producers set up their own in-house testing labs, their own research and development programs. And then the whole time I've been doing that, I've been doing a lot of teaching and writing, and I have the Curious About Cannabis podcast. I wrote a book called Curious About Cannabis as well that's being used by universities and colleges all over North America and abroad to teach about cannabis science. So I've been at this for a while, and my point in kind of laying a lot of that out is I got into cannabis testing really early on in the early 2010s when there were no testing regulations. I got into it before there were even legal dispensaries. And I've been a part of this growth of the industry ever since then. And I've seen a lot, I've learned a lot, and now we're learning more and more that this issue of laboratory fraud is pretty rampant in the industry. It was rampant back then. It's one reason why our own lab struggled, because we would lose so many clients because of our quote-unquote low THC numbers. So today I kind of wanted to talk about this issue of quality in the cannabis industry, because it's obvious we have a serious problem. And this problem is put on full display in the news media year after year after year, whether it's issues related to product quality. Like the LA Times article this summer just pointed out that there are pesticides turning up in products that went through licensed accredited testing and are still on the shelf being sold to people with these pesticides in there. We're seeing clear evidence of THC boosting, of laboratory shopping. We see ridiculous numbers like 45% THC on a cannabis flower, which is not even physically possible. So we have this distrust in the products. We also have a distrust in the data. So just the general trust in laboratories and the data that they're producing has gotten very, very low. And it's understandable. Just look at all of these different articles that have come out going back to when testing regulations first started to come around in 2015, 16 or so. Every year there has been an article that's come out talking about laboratory fraud, THC boosting, and all of these issues that we're still dealing with here almost 10 years later. And then it's not only an issue with the data, but it's also an issue with legitimate safety. And of course there's consumer safety that we're all worried about, but there's also worker safety, which I think a lot less people really give serious consideration. And we're seeing evidence that when facilities are not properly managing quality, when they're not properly managing safety, and just in what we see publicly in the news media, we know that there have been deaths associated with working conditions in cannabis facilities. And these are things that are preventable and in general highlight just how serious of a situation we have on our hands, that obviously the testing labs are sacrificing quality to some degree. Not all of them. There are good ones out there, but they are struggling, and we can see through the data that they get pushed out of the market. But for the most part, we have labs that are sacrificing their integrity and quality. We have producers sacrificing their integrity and quality through lab shopping, through doing all sorts of different things, not managing worker safety properly, all of these things. This is just what we see publicly. Now, what I've seen privately is a lot more. And this tells me that there is a lot going on behind the scenes that no one really knows about very well yet. The public doesn't really understand, but it's happening in licensed, accredited facilities. Some of the things that I've seen, things like John Hammond syndrome, where you have somebody who decides they want to start up a lab and they've got access to money and some vision of what they think a lab should be. So they walk in and say, hey, spare no expense, let's build a $2-3 million laboratory. But they have no perspective on what an analytical laboratory actually is or how it works from a business perspective or even a scientific perspective. And then they end up usually hiring people which they are not themselves equipped to train, educate, or even vet. And so you see the series of things that happen where you end up with a very expensive lab with very high overhead run by people that don't quite understand really what they're doing, but they're making it work. And the company just bleeds. And quality definitely is not properly managed in that sort of situation. We also see time and time again evidence of supreme micromanaging, and this is kind of exacerbated by the fact that these licensed facilities have surveillance equipment that's readily available. So anybody can plot themselves down in front of a terminal and watch monitors of these video cameras and try to look for things that are wrong. Very, very bad approach to management in general, and we can talk later about why that is. But that tends to lead to a compromised quality system overall, because when people are micromanaged, they tend to not feel much autonomy in their work or pride in their work. They also tend to not take ownership in the outcomes of their work, and they just sort of check out and dissociate. And in order for a strong quality system to function, you've got to have everyone bought in and really working towards the same goal, and micromanagement completely sacrifices that. Another common thing that I've seen in labs are managers and lab directors that are put into place that don't actually have any autonomy or decision-making authority, and they're just sort of put there to do what the CEO or the owner wants until something goes wrong, and then they're usually replaced, which sets an incredibly bad precedent for the culture of the company. Another thing that I've seen a lot is what I like to call Slack abuse. This is over-communication, communication at all hours, managers and leaders expecting their team to be on call all the time and using this communication app, Slack, to do it. I've also seen it done with Teams and other apps as well, but Slack is the most common one. And this over-communication, this is a form of micromanagement, and so all of the problems we talk about with micromanagement come up with this as well. Another thing I see a lot in labs are siloed departments that are making decisions based on their own interests or self-interest of an individual rather than the interests of the lab as a whole or the organization as a whole. For instance, one department might be trying to save money and is ordering things that are cheaper and is not communicating with another department that has very particular needs for a supply. And so then one department, in an effort to try to save money and cut costs, they buy something that the lab can't use, and then another order has to be placed for the thing that they do need, and then you've spent even more money. You've actually hurt the company rather than help things. So this is usually a symptom of bad communication, bad alignment between departments, and it's super common. Another thing I've seen and been involved with is situations where a company is wrapped up in so many licensing and equity deals that they can't even really make decisions in their own interest. They've made too many promises to too many people that they are stuck. And then, of course, one thing that I've seen and also been a part of is companies that outsource their entire quality system to consultants. Usually this is because they want to get licensed really quickly, so they hire a consultant and say, build us our documentation, get us accredited, boom, boom, boom. And then when they get to the other side, they really don't understand how their quality system works or why they even have it. It becomes a checkboxing activity just so they can get licensed and get operational so they can start making money. Not realizing that if they were to actually value their quality system and treat it with the respect it deserves, it would help ensure their long-term viability. But alas. Now, other things that I've seen that you might not expect, things like 100% no findings on an ISO or a GMP audit. How does that happen? Very strange. And when you start to think about the incentive structures at play, it makes a little bit more sense, because the whole way the system is designed, you have these certifying and accrediting bodies which make money off of these laboratories annually going through certifications. And then there's also pressure from the state on these accrediting and certifying bodies to get laboratories approved, so that usually the bottlenecks that they experience with these labs can be addressed. So you end up seeing labs that end up getting through accreditation or end up passing their audits that probably shouldn't, and in some cases definitely shouldn't. And you end up with these weird situations where accreditors are offering these exemplary reports and essentially making good friends with new customers. And that is a problem. I've seen 100% GMP audits on the producer side, where I know just from my own experience in internal auditing that there are all sorts of things that the facility needs to work on or improve upon that should be very obvious to anyone who steps into that facility, especially an auditor who theoretically should have more experience and be more well trained at looking at quality systems of these production facilities than I am. Yet somehow some of these facilities get 100% audits. I don't understand exactly how that works. There's no such thing as a perfect system, a perfect quality system, or a perfect product manufacturing facility. And you can see here in the list, there's so many other things that I've seen. And then, of course, when we get into worker safety, I have colleagues of mine that have been growing cannabis for decades that now can't touch a cannabis plant. I have a mentor of mine who can't be around essential oils because he's developed a very strong acute VOC toxicity reaction anytime that he's around terpenes. I have people I've worked with that had asthma that were asked to dispose of moldy cannabis and to be involved in grinding and decarboxylation where they're exposed to bioaerosols constantly. I've myself experienced immune system failures due to stress. There was one year I had shingles twice, my most stressful year in the industry. Had shingles twice and started to exhibit signs of arthritis early. And then there's the mental health side, the burnout, depression, anxiety. These are occupational hazards of the industry. When you're trying to do good work and you're not being rewarded for scientific integrity, honesty, accuracy, precision, all of these things, and you're just being asked to do more and more and more and compromise more and more, it leads to some severe burnout and depression and ongoing anxiety and a kind of form of PTSD going forward in the industry. You experience that enough and it really takes a toll on your psyche. And that affects your physical health as well. So I've seen all of this, the consequences of poor quality management. And a lot of it seems to stem from a few core issues. So I tried to put together a bit of kind of a proposition or an argument here of how I see the problem. So the first part of this is that a lot of organizations fundamentally misunderstand quality at its core. They often think of it as efficiency or quality control, just trying to keep things in specifications, or they think of it as regulatory compliance. And this fundamental misunderstanding trickles out into a lot of other problems. The other part of this is the regulatory structure. So when regulatory structures are set up in a way that do not fully appreciate the system of which they're managing, you tend to see these perverse incentive structures and undue burdens that are put on companies, whether it be taxes, over-regulations, and things like that, that end up putting these companies into survival mode, where they then sacrifice long-term vision, long-term viability, and then opt for short-term gains, which often leads to things like THC boosting, or on the producer side, lab shopping. And then to bring this all back around, research has really shown that in order for a quality system to be effective, you have to have buy-in and engagement from leadership. You have to have the full engagement of all of the staff that are part of the organization. And you need to have regulatory structures set up that promote quality and reward quality and incentivize those types of behaviors. And from my perspective, the cannabis industry has failed on all of these parts These organizations a lot of times are misunderstanding quality, so the leadership's not really bought into quality management in the first place, and then that trickles out into a lot of employees not really understanding quality management. You have a lot of leaders that like to micromanage, so then that loss of autonomy, so you don't have really employee engagement, you don't even have really leadership engagement in the way that you should, and then you don't have a regulatory structure that really incentivizes quality in the first place. So there are many ways to tackle this problem, and what I want to present today is kind of a philosophical approach to deal with some of the underlying foundational issues around the misunderstanding of what quality is and how it applies to an organization or an industry. But there are other ways, more specific practical approaches to tackle these problems. And I'm working on a series that I'll be releasing over the next several weeks that really dives into some of the data around how do we know lab fraud is happening, what's happening, why is it happening, and what do we do about it. So stay tuned for that. For this lecture, I primarily want to focus on my general philosophical approach to quality systems, and then I'll link that to how I think it can start to solve a lot of these problems. So from my perspective, this industry, and really industries across the world, but particularly the cannabis industry, is overdue for a quality revolution. And the United States particularly has been a little slow to adopt this sort of new philosophy. But it really comes back to a quality guru and statistician named W. Edwards Deming, who lived basically throughout the entire 20th century. He was born in 1900 and lived in 1993. And his real claim to fame came after World War II when he went to Japan, and he completely transformed kind of the economy of Japan and the manufacturing culture in Japan to be more focused on quality, long-term viability, systems thinking, and that sort of thing. And so now, even in Japan, they have the Deming Prize, which is one of the highest honors that someone can be awarded in industry in Japan.
So Deming claimed that quality should be aimed at the needs of the customer, present and future. And it's important to stop here because a lot of people assume that when he says customer, he's talking about who's the end consumer, but that's a different concept. When Deming is talking about a customer in this context, the customer is anyone who needs something from anyone else. So like in the lab, different staff members are customers to each other, different departments are customers to each other, and have different needs and expectations. And quality ultimately is about trying to meet those needs and exceed those expectations through systemic processes that are continuously improving, that are being managed by the highest leadership. That's kind of, in a nutshell, how Deming thought about quality.
And this is a quote I really, really like from Deming that sort of summarizes the whole issue and segues us into this sort of grand philosophy that I wanted to outline for you. In this quote, Deming says, "Quality is determined by the top management. It cannot be delegated. Moreover, an essential ingredient that I call profound knowledge is missing." And this concept of profound knowledge is what we're going to really hang on to, because what Deming went on to develop is what's called the system of profound knowledge. So it's all about addressing this gap of profound knowledge missing from leadership. He goes on to say, "Hard work, best efforts, and intentions will not by themselves create quality or a market." This is huge. A lot of people come into the cannabis industry with good intentions, and they work hard. They do their best. But that's not going to necessarily ensure that you survive. It's not going to ensure that you develop quality products. It's not even going to ensure that you keep your workers safe. There's more required. You have to have this culture of lifelong learning and filling this gap of profound knowledge. And then Deming went on to say, transformation of management is required, learning and application of profound knowledge. These are the things that I want to focus on today, is that ultimately what the industry is screaming at us is that we need to go back, or maybe develop maybe we were never there, but develop this culture of lifelong learning and establishing profound knowledge. And so let's talk about what profound knowledge means and what the system of profound knowledge is that Deming proposed. So Deming's system of profound knowledge consists of 4 primary parts, and they're all overlapping. So they're not separate from each other, and no one piece is bigger or more important than another. They all coexist and work together, and you can't have one without the others. So one part of this is appreciation of the system. So what is the system we're in? How do we measure it? How do we monitor it? That sort of thing. Knowledge of variation. So how does the system vary? What are common causes of variation that are inherent to how the system functions? And what are extraordinary causes of variation that are not inherent to the system that represent something we need to fix or change? We also have a theory of knowledge, which is part of this whole system. So how do we know what we know? What should we be trying to understand or to learn? What should we be monitoring? What kind of data do we need? How do we synthesize the information that we have coming in? All of this is related to this philosophical concept called epistemology, which is just the study of knowledge. What does it mean to know things? What do we actually know? And what are we actually just speculating or guessing, and that sort of thing. And then the other piece to the system of profound knowledge is psychology. So the human element. What are the intrinsic and extrinsic motivations of the people that are involved in this system? What do they need? Why are they here? What do they care about? How are people communicating with each other and interrelating with one another? These are all things that matter if you want to establish strong operations and a strong quality system that is continuously improving quickly and responding to issues quickly and proactively, and to have a team that is ready for anything. You've got to understand the human element. This is where micromanagement falls apart, because it completely sabotages that psychological element, that human element. People in general want to feel pride over their work. They want to feel like they own something, that they're contributing to something good that's greater than themselves, all of these things. And if you manage people in a way that compromises all of that, then you're also compromising part of the system of profound knowledge, which means you're not adequately really learning or gaining any new knowledge that you can bring into your system to improve it. You start spinning your wheels, you start building ruts, or you start going off track completely. So let's talk a little bit more about each of these components. So appreciation of the system, like I said, this is about just understanding what are we in? What is the context of which we're operating? And this means taking a step back and observing and listening and charting things out and recognizing, like, who are the stakeholders involved in everything that we're doing? What do they care about? How do the regulations influence how we're doing things? How do our relationships with other people in the industry influence how we're doing things? All of this sort of systems thinking is incredibly important, because it leads into these other parts where we're trying to understand, okay, what is the natural behavior of the system, and how do we monitor and guide that to where we need it to go? So one way that Deming kind of talked about this appreciation of the system was through an experiment called the red bead experiment, which ultimately was meant to illustrate kind of the error of ranking employees based on performance, when their performance is inherently tied to the system itself. And so basically with this experiment, you have all of these red and white beads that are mixed up, and then you have a little paddle with these dimples in it that can catch the beads. You take a series of workers, you have an SOP that explains exactly how you dip the tray in, how you shake it to get the beads to settle in, how you count the beads, record your score, and move on. Everyone goes through the system, is perfectly trained, demonstrates that they understand the training and can perform well. Then they're put on the production line, and basically the manager in the exercise ranks all of the workers based on how many white beads they have versus red beads. And the goal is to have as few red beads as possible. And over time, they end up letting go the workers who repeatedly have low numbers and keep the ones with high numbers. And what you end up seeing is, over time, everyone is doomed, because ultimately, whether you get red or however many red or white beads you get is totally random. I mean, you have no control over that because that's built into the system. And so these managers are basically trying to motivate employees to do something that they can't do because the outcomes of their work are not tied to anything they have control over. It's tied to the behavior of the system itself. And so then moving on to theory of knowledge, how do we know what we know? A lot of this comes down to really, really good team dynamics and communication strategies. People have to feel comfortable debating and disagreeing. This also comes down to an investment in learning. So a company should see the value in getting their employees involved in continuous education and professional improvement and all of these sorts of things. Because this is how we not only gather information, because information is very limited. Information is just data. Knowledge is wisdom. Knowledge is taking information, studying it, and understanding how to integrate it so that you can make predictions and move into the future. And prediction is a big part of Deming's model, because this is very much, even though it's a philosophical sort of idea, it's very scientific. It's all about gathering data, making predictions, trying to further engineer systems so that you can predict their outcomes. It's very, very scientific and heavily philosophical at the same time. Knowledge of variation. So this is one I've seen a lot of labs kind of fail on. Why are things varying? Why are results now here when they used to be here? Or why are we seeing batches that all of a sudden are not emulsifying when they used to? Why does this concentrate have this waxy texture when before it was very liquidy? The answers to these kinds of questions all come from a knowledge of variation. And that knowledge of variation comes from monitoring your systems to understand how they behave under typical scenarios so that you can then recognize the extraordinary causes of variation. And Deming repeatedly said that from his experience with all these different companies that he would consult, usually around 94% of the variation that an organization saw in their operations came from the system itself, and were not special fires that needed to be put out, but they represented core issues around how the system is set up and programmed. And so the idea is then you have to go back and figure out what are the fundamental misunderstandings or issues, what policy or procedure or miscommunication or whatever is driving how the system is working, that it's allowing these outcomes that we don't want. So very, very critical. And one experiment that Deming did to illustrate this point is the funnel experiment. So this is where you have a funnel over a target, and you're dropping marbles through the funnel and mapping where the marbles fall. And then the idea is, what do you do to make your results more accurate? And Deming provides like 4 different strategies basically, and explains what happens if you take each one. The first strategy is to do nothing. So you just let the marbles fall where they fall. You don't change anything about the system, and you accept that the little spread of marbles that you have is just what you have, and you accept it. The next thing would be to start to move either the target or the funnel based on where the last marble dropped. So if you dropped a marble and it got 2 centimeters away from the target, then move the target or the funnel 2 centimeters in the associated direction to compensate for that difference. And then you should hit the target, right? But it doesn't work that way. That one drop you saw was only one instance. And the outcome you get from that one instance doesn't represent the spread of outcomes you're going to get if you drop over and over and over again. And so what you're doing is you're then you're overcorrecting based on one result and not the average of the whole. And you end up widening the spread of your marble falls. So your target spread then gets bigger. So you're not getting more accurate, you're actually getting less accurate. Well, then what if we just start to adjust based on every fall that happens? Now we start to get a very strange distribution pattern that kind of looks like an infinity symbol when you map this out statistically. And Then the other fourth strategy is, what if we just randomly change things every time and just see what happens? And of course, then we're in chaos. And so out of all of these scenarios, the best thing to do would have been to do nothing. That would have led to the smallest spread and would have been the most accurate. So this whole experiment is a warning about tweaking systems. And that ultimately, a lot of times, there's very little we need to do to a system to get the outcomes we need. And it's very, very easy to overcorrect. And it's very, very easy to kind of miss the ball and change things based on a limited amount of information that doesn't represent the system as a whole. So be careful about tweaking systems. The way that you can be careful about tweaking systems is to have good knowledge of variation. And then, of course, the psychology piece, which I've already talked about kind of at length here. But one thing I wanted to mention that I see a lot in the cannabis industry is, on one side, particularly with scientists, but really everybody, is everyone's kind of undercompensated. A lot of these companies are startups, and particularly in testing labs and in more high-tech research and development labs for product manufacturers, you end up with people that are operating more from passion than for money. So you have the undercompensation issue, which is a part of the psychological element. There's a certain minimum amount people do need to make in order to not worry so much about money and be able to focus on other things that are important to them. On the flip side, there's another interesting thing that happens sometimes where businesses will overcompensate to try to keep an employee around when the culture is really bad. And so I've seen both sides of that I think is really interesting. You have companies that perpetually undercompensate their employees, and you have morale that suffers for that. And then you have companies that overcompensate, and morale is going to suffer anyway because whatever's wrong with the system, it's not going away just because you pay these people more money. And there comes a point where quality of life and psychological well-being, autonomy, ownership of work, all of that sort of stuff kicks in and becomes more important than just getting the paycheck. And of course, there's other aspects to this too. And the main thing Deming wanted to get across around the psychology element of the system of profound knowledge is that everyone comes into life with this natural curiosity and wanting to learn and wanting to experiment and share their curiosities. And ultimately, these are things that leaders have to tap into if they want their team to operate at their full, capacity. And if you want quality to improve in an organization and quality of products to improve, safety of working conditions to improve, and all of that, it goes a long way to tap into those intrinsic motivating factors. Money is an extrinsic motivating factor. And like I said, it only gets you so far. It's the intrinsic motivating factors that get you further and get you where you're really needing to go. And if those are being ignored, you cannot expect the system to function properly. And so you can kind of see how all of these things interrelate. And when the system of profound knowledge is functioning at its best, it addresses what Deming had published on previously before he came up with the system of profound knowledge, which are his 14 points of quality leadership.
So just to quickly break down some of these points of quality management that kind of get satisfied when the system of profound knowledge is properly managed. First of all, you have a constancy of purpose. Everyone knows why they're here, what the company's mission and vision is, and what's going to drive them into the future. Everyone is adopting the new philosophy, this commitment to the quality revolution, that everyone is managing quality, leadership is participating and bought in. And this leads to ending a dependence on inspections because you start to establish quality throughout the entire process upstream. So while you may have endpoint inspections and testing to meet regulatory needs or whatever, generally the outcomes of those inspections will not be a surprise because you already know, based on the quality integrated in the rest of the process upstream, that it's going to turn out okay. You start to focus on quality over price. So when you're buying supplies, working with vendors, you recognize the long-term value that quality has over price. And usually when you're shortcutting yourself on price, you're paying for it later some other way. And so you start to develop stronger relationships with suppliers and prioritize things in a different way. You have this focus on constantly improving and recognizing that nothing's ever perfect. There's always things we can be changing and improving. And in general, everyone in the organization is empowered to think about the small changes they can make in their systems, their subsystems, to contribute to the overall outcomes of the system as a whole. You have constant training. You have, instead of managers, leaders. Managers are more or less about keeping things in control. Leaders drive things into the future. You see an extinguishment of fear in the system, because when there's fear in the system, there are fudged numbers, there's a breakdown of communication, there are a lot of issues that happen when managing from a standpoint of fear. And so when a quality system is functioning strongly and operations are really humming because of the system of profound knowledge, you tend to not have management styles that focus on fear. You focus on driving out fear, recognizing that it's actually an antithesis to you getting a clear sense of what's going on in the system. And this also leads to breaking down barriers between departments, barriers in communication. Whatever these friction points are, we start to smooth those out so that the system can hum even better. We get rid of superficial slogans and quotas. These things, again, steer the system away from what really matters and start to focus on how do we make things look good on paper. And that's not what we're trying to do. We also see an increase in the pride of workmanship among employees. People have more autonomy, they own their work more, and they're working together to improve things. And overall, you see this great sense of pride, which is tapping into those intrinsic sources of motivation. And then, of course, related to that is this valuing of education and self-improvement, that management values, taking care of their team and giving them opportunities to improve or work on things that interest them that might not be their core focus of their job, etc. And then finally, everybody is committed. Everyone's taking action here. Everyone is a quality officer. While there may be someone with the title of quality manager who's kind of just making sure everything is working properly, everyone is a part of quality. Everyone is a quality officer. And really, the highest leadership is the true quality manager of the organization. And all of these parts, again, none of them are more significant than the other. They're all interrelated, and they come together. So this is all just kind of what naturally comes, again, starting at this foundation of the system of profound knowledge, having an appreciation of the system, knowledge of variation, a theory of knowledge, an understanding of psychology, and then satisfying these 14 points. This creates an operational system that improves itself and moves forward, and increases in both efficiency and effectiveness over time.
I think if a lot of organizations took a step back and just thought about what quality management means and what quality means, and could start to really appreciate some of these points, I think a lot of organizations would naturally move towards substantial improvements in worker safety, of course, but product quality and innovation, consumer safety, etc. And so, my goal here for this talk is to try to invite you all to be a part of this quality revolution and really promote these issues wherever you work in whatever capacity. So now let's talk about, on a practical level, how we could use these Deming principles, the system of profound knowledge, to tackle issues like lab shopping in the industry. And I believe ultimately, if done thoughtfully, what that process would then yield would be several of these suggestions here. So, and this is just my opinion, but taking this lens and applying it to the industry, my perspective is right away we should be de-emphasizing THC values on cannabis flower. This THC value has weight behind it. And if there's a way to de-emphasize it and bring attention to other quality attributes of cannabis, that could start to tackle the problem. Tackling the issue of lab shopping, a very simple solution could be double blinding the whole process. You could have a situation where the state samples the product and takes liability for the sampling, and then contracts the testing out to a random lab that is a part of their program. The producer never knows which lab tests their product until after the fact, and the lab doesn't know which producer samples they have until after the fact. This would create a degree of separation that would make lab shopping essentially impossible as far as I can figure it. And this would still allow R&D testing, so the data of which producers actually want to be accurate anyway, you could still do that. You could still find your labs and use them for R&D testing, but when it comes to compliance testing, that would become a double-blinded process. That would essentially deal with some of the lab shopping issues and put more pressure on the labs to issue quality data, which they know is going to be audited, rather than trying to please a client, of which they don't know who the client is. I also think under this model, it might make sense to subsidize testing costs. It would make sense to subsidize these costs to alleviate some of the cost burden on producers, as well as to ensure labs that they are going to get paid for the work that they do, and they're not going to be holding a $10,000 compliance testing bill because a company just went out of business because you issued them a test result that was not favorable. So to get past some of that, I think subsidizing some of the testing costs for compliance would make a lot of sense, and it could help both the lab and the producer in the process. I also think it makes sense to build incentives for quality in the regulations. It makes a lot of sense to give tax breaks and special accommodations to companies that can go out of their way to demonstrate their commitment to quality. If after multiple audits they're showing extreme consistency and they've got a strong quality system and all these things, don't make them pay as much to stay in the system. Give them a break. Give producers something to look forward to if they do things right, and testing labs as well. But there's little things you could do to give them some incentive. The tax breaks could be a big one. Breaks on licensing fees so that it's not as costly to renew each year. And then we need to develop more robust quality programs for how these regulations are made in the first place. If you remember going back in Deming's quote, he said, best intentions, hard work, all of that is great, but it doesn't ensure quality, nor does it ensure a market. And if we want this market to persist in a way that we like, that's favorable, we need to get this quality issue under control. Now we'll stop for a reality check. Now I'm well aware the industry is a mess, and it's nice to talk about these philosophical solutions and companies changing their ways and everything's sunshine and rainbows, and that's not how things actually are. I get it. And that's why ultimately this whole thing comes back to us. This quality revolution I'm talking about, while yes, that can lead to major changes in organizations, and I've seen incredible transformations in some of the organizations that I've worked with and helped, but really all we can do is commit to this ourselves and do what we can ourselves. And I really like this quote, the first step is transformation of the individual. The transformation is discontinuous, meaning it doesn't end. It comes from an understanding of the system of profound knowledge. The individual, once transformed, they'll set an example. They'll be a good listener, but they will not compromise. And they will continually teach other people. And they will help people come into the new philosophy without feeling guilty for how they used to do things before. I think that's what we need. So that's my invitation to you. Please join me on this quality revolution. We have big work to do in this industry to produce better quality products for people, to better communicate with consumers, to produce better data from the testing labs, to learn more and develop more and innovate more, and to keep people safe that want to work with this plant, to ensure that they can keep working with the plant their whole lives and not end up like one acquaintance of mine from Oregon who can't even touch a cannabis plant anymore. He's been growing for 30 years and he can't touch a plant anymore because he's allergic and developed sensitivity over time because he didn't take adequate steps to protect himself all those years. These things can be avoided. Things can be so much better And we can stop seeing all of these news articles coming out talking about the rampant fraud and just wild behavior in the industry. We can all do our part in whatever small way we can. So please join me in the quality revolution. And some of my last advice for any of you out there working for cannabis businesses is to find your own constancy of purpose. Figure out why you're here. Like, this industry is crazy. These companies are all startup companies. What are you doing here? It's important to know the answer to that question and to feel it in your heart, because you're going to be challenged with a lot of things. But if you don't have that constancy of purpose, you're going to burn out and you're going to run away from this industry within a few years. My other piece of advice is to never stop learning, which is kind of the whole point of Deming's system of profound knowledge. The learning never stops. And then one analogy I often use when I'm training people is, in this industry and really in life, you have to learn to be sort of the pebble in the river of chaos. When a rock is initially deposited in a river and it has all of its edges, it feels a lot of resistance and a lot of tension, and there's a lot of turbulence that builds around that rock as it's trying to sort of stop the waters of chaos. And over time, the rock smooths out, the waters wash over and around, and that rock grounds itself and becomes part of the riverbed. My advice is to become like those rocks. A lot of this chaos you cannot stop on your own, and if you get too worked up, you'll feel lost in a void, and instead it's important to return to your constancy of purpose. Figure out how to let the chaos of the industry and just all of the madness and all the voices and perspectives and everything, the weird regulations, let it all wash over you and around you, but not carry you away. And then finally, the last part is mind your physical and mental health, which is exactly what the pebble analogy is about. I've gone through burnout probably 3 or 4 times now in this industry, but I'm still here because of my constancy of purpose, because of the value that I get from trying to help others navigate these waters. And by now, too, I feel like I've seen enough. It becomes predictable, just like Deming talked about. When the systems become predictable, then we can start to influence them and find ways to improve things, which is what quality is all about. And to bring it all back around, what is quality? Quality is about meeting and exceeding customer expectations and needs. It's about continuously improving, and it's about maintaining commitment from leadership. So let's do everything we can to make this industry better and improve quality in whatever aspect of work that we do. I thank you so much for listening to this talk and giving me the time of day. I hope that this has had some impact or has been, of some value to you. So with that, everybody, stay curious and take it easy. I appreciate you all. Bye-bye, everybody.